these sites, these holy sites, become a contest for whose version of history is the one true version. And it is true between the great three monotheistic traditions, and it's true within those traditions. That the sites, the physical sites, become the place of contest. Yeah?
I almost don't know how to ask this question, but culturally, and this has changed even in our culture, but to be born out of wedlock is considered illegitimate.
Right.
So like if I had 3 kids and one was illegitimate, I would love them all the same. But society might look down on the one born out of wedlock in a different way. And I feel like that's the Judaic-Christian heritage. So in Islam, is there any sense that Ishmael was born out of wedlock? Is that like a slight? I mean, we kind of look down at Ishmael as born out of wedlock, right? Because he was married to Sarah, and he's got a slave, and he had a baby with her. Is that, because like when I read The Kite Runner, which I know is fiction, but his major character had a child out of wedlock, and that was like considered shameful for him.
Yeah, the whole concept of out of wedlock is a monotheistic, is a Christian monotheistic notion of monogamy.
So how does Islam?
So it's not out of wedlock. It's if Muhammad himself had anywhere between 9 and 12 wives. So are they all born out of wedlock, or is it a culture in which polygamy is acceptable? Or very different cultures. So you're coming out of if you come out of a European cultural context of Christian monogamy, then you would obviously look down on a religion whose that the main ancestor is born out of wedlock. But that whole language is inappropriate for a different culture.
I guess
it's not seen that way.
But it seems like in the Kite Runner,
and it may be, and let me just add that it may be. There's a populist democratic notion in Islam, and you see some of this in the Jewish biblical context as well. A lot of biblical literature has within it rather revolutionary populist notions that the lesser are greater, that the poorer are richer. You see this in Jesus. You see this in the fact that throughout the book of Genesis, the Jewish biblical book, it's the younger sons that get favored, which is the opposite of the classic Middle Eastern notion of primogeniture, which is that the eldest gets everything. So there's a kind of reversal of justice systems for the underprivileged. And I wouldn't be surprised as if, in that regard, Hagar and Ishmael and them becoming the great nation is a reversal. It's a reversal. It's an embrace of the servant. It's an embrace of what would be otherwise considered lesser, but not born out of the language out of wedlock, illegitimate, would not be appropriate. But it would be appropriate to say that clearly they were kicked out, and yet God favored them. That would be the story. In the same way that Jesus doesn't embrace prostitution, but his embrace of the prostitute is a statement about God's compassion being on all, and it's a reversal to critique a dominant culture or a dominant society.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
I have a question about Abraham's travel to his actual journey to Mecca. How did that happen? I mean, this has never scientifically been proven, or it's never been established.
Yeah.
Or has it? Did he actually? Because in the Quran it doesn't specify.
There's no scientific evidence for any of the stories. In other words, Abraham's existence is not a shred of evidence for a Jewish Abraham or there's a tomb, but there's no evidence for a story from 3,000-4,000 years ago. It's just these are constructs of a person in the literature, which is very old. It's at least 2,000 years for the Jewish literature and 1,000 years for the revelation to Muhammad, or 1,500, I should say, and that's all there is. There isn't any. So if Islam has Abraham going to Mecca, and the Bible has Abraham going all around Israel, then those are just the stories.
But logically, though, why would Abraham choose? Why would he choose to go to Mecca, rebuild the Kaaba or build the Kaaba, and then go back, travel thousands and thousands of miles?
Oh, I mean, the Bible has Abraham traveling thousands of miles too. The Hebrew Bible. That is an interesting aspect of the Hebrew biblical story and of the Quran, and that is, we're talking about nomadic people. It obviously was not considered unusual that Abraham migrated from an area east of Syria and Iraq on foot when he was called by God to leave his country and go to a land I promised you. It was, my God, I could understand if it was moving from Jordan to Israel, but it was like, my God, that was a long distance. So if it has him going to Mecca, it's just a part of a nomadic story. I don't see it as unusual at all. The interesting thing is that, I don't know whether it predates, but there are Jewish midrashic stories that are very parallel to the Islamic story of Abraham going to Arabia in search of Ishmael. That secretly, without Sarah knowing it, he travels to Arabia and he tries to find Ishmael, and he meets one wife of Ishmael's and then another, and they had specifically Arabic names. I think one of them was called Fatima, and I don't remember the other one, but it was, and Abraham approved, and this is in Jewish literature. So sometimes, it wasn't always the case that these religions' hermeneutics are adversarial, that they're hateful. Often they are. Often it's competitive, often it's critical, but sometimes you'll find within one religion a very sympathetic read of the other, or they'll talk about each other through metaphor, through the lives of Abraham, the patriarchs and the matriarchs. They'll talk to each other and about each other. This is going back a long time, and it's hard for you folks. You're not students of religion so much, and I can tell you it's just an amazing story of people talking but not talking, or talking through metaphors and stories to each other over the barrier of culture. It's never been a direct conversation, and it's never been a conversation among equals. And that's the biggest problem today, is that one group is always perceived to have to be dominant in order for the conversation to go on. That's what's unprecedented. And it's what may lead or has been leading to, I wouldn't say an overt religious war, but a subtle one, because it's an unprecedented construct for monotheistic visions of both the origins of things and the destiny of things. In all of these traditions, there is an assumption that there is a future in which all people will recognize the truth of that religion, or the truth of the one God, and their interpretation of that God. And that means that it's not easy to find a notion of pluralism in any of these in these traditions. That's why some of the commentary, some of the writings that you've seen from Abu Nimr summarizes from Sachedina, Abdulaziz Sachedina, are really working on the notion of Islam and democracy, Islam and pluralism, and see what are the possibilities. And what you see happening is that basically people will work on interpretation and the building of constructs from what has been before, and the justification of interpretation being an ongoing dynamic system. An ongoing dynamic system. Now, another key element to understanding this is, what is the role of revelation? What is the idea of revelation in these biblically based traditions? Is revelation something fixed, or is it something fluid? I mean, consider it. If you're part of there's all sorts of tribal cultures around the world, and indigenous people's religions, particularly when people haven't been exiled anywhere, where there's an ongoing infusion of the sacred, as it were, through prophets or prophetesses or occult leaders, diviners, that can give you guidance. And it really seems as if these kind of practices of divining the truth, or what guidance should be, depend upon a certain degree of stability in residence somewhere. So that, for example, in ancient Israel, there were a lot of prophets running around, and then there were a lot of prophets running around, and then there were certain magical practices the high priest wore a breastplate, and that breastplate had these special crystals, and they'd ask questions, and it was called the Urim and Tumim, and they'd ask questions, and it would light up with some answers. Now, you find that kind of divining tradition all over the world in different kinds of cultures. It's all considered to have disappeared with the exile. So prophecy is finalized in this book, this revelation called the Bible, and the rabbis determine which books are in and which books are out, because there were a lot of prophetic books, and there were a lot of prophets who didn't write anything down. But all of that is supposed to come to an end. And now it's the book that becomes the source of authority and the revelation. Because a book is transportable. A book is transnational. And so it's, if you think about it, it's etching in stone a lot. Whereas if you're in a local place, and a new prophet can come along all the time and give you guidance, or a diviner, or some sort of system of divining things. So one of the things that happens in these three traditions is that they authentically become migratory, transnational phenomena, which was great for exile. It's also great for empires and conquest, because that means you have this thing that you can now transport everywhere, and this is the authoritative text. But of course you realize that once it becomes rigidly the authority, it's much harder to be fluid about, well, your religion is fine and my religion is fine. I mean, where is the most, I mean, if you bracket the problem in India of the deep resentment between Hindus and Muslims based on imperial conquest and so on, you have a massive Muslim minority in India that was an inheritance of the Mughal invasions, and all of this resentment historically. And you forget about that for a moment, and you think about the 1,000-odd sects within India in Hinduism. You see a place that's very, very comfortable with all sorts of people having their own forms of worship, their own forms of divining, their own forms of figuring things out. Because India's always been in the same place, you see. There's no, the motherland can contain multiple accesses to the truth or to a way of being, because it's all in one place. But if somehow all Indians were exiled suddenly, the texts would become more important, and the text would have to become hardened, otherwise you'd lose everything. So another challenge of monotheism in terms of coexistence and equal existence is the fact that you now have very distinct revelations. You have the Hebrew Bible, you have the New Testament, and you have the Quran that are very much etched in stone. So what do you do? And those stones are very unique stories, unique forms of salvation, unique forms of truth. Well, you interpret. If you are an enlightened Muslim philosopher in the 12th century, or you're an enlightened Christian philosopher or a Jewish philosopher, you interpret. You interpret for the science of your day, you interpret for the situation of your day. It's interpretation. Not democratic interpretation the way today, but authoritative, clerical interpretation that does give you some freedom to work with the revelatory text and all the traditions that have been accrued. So in Islam, there's the Quran, which is very clear, and then there's the Sunnah, and there's the Hadith, the sayings of the Prophet that were all carried orally. Eventually they're written down. But all of these give more fluidity to the tradition. Now it's interesting that in the modern period, as Abdulaziz Sachedina, for example, who is a Shiite scholar, is trying to move back to an Islam that can cope with many changes, with new issues of pluralism, of women's equality, and all of these things, he is going back to the Quranic text, and he doesn't want to be tyrannized as much by all sorts of rigid oral interpretations in history by men who are flawed and imperfect. And he's making in some ways the same move that Martin Luther made with Protestantism. In other words, when you have a tradition that has a revelation and then it gets overlaid by generations or centuries of men who interpret that in a very clear way, interpretively, when revolution happens, what you sometimes want to do is go back to the original text and say, there is a clear tradition within Islam that permits and even encourages interpretation, ijtihad. And I'm simplifying all of this, of course. These are you'll see some summaries of this in Abu Nimr, but it's you have to read Sachedina in details. These are very elaborate legal and non-legal traditions. But he's making, if you look at it in the large picture of it, he's making a move. It's a democratic move towards interpretation. It's not radically democratic. It's not, and in many ways, the Protestant Reformation at the beginning was radically democratic, and immediately it pulls back from that. It really isn't about everybody being able to interpret the New Testament on their own. It immediately pulls back to very rigid communal standards. And it's very interesting to see the way religions seem to open up at some point, to throw away the dross, to become uncorrupt, and then immediately all the structures of control come right back in to what's allowable to be said and what's not allowable. You think that with the most conservative side of Christianity in the United States is a side that has the most freewheeling notions of inspiration and prophecy and speaking directly to God, and you think that, my gosh, anything's possible. But actually, it becomes a highly rigid, highly controlled, environment. So, what I'm problematizing is the rigidification of traditions through the notion of revelation, of the idea that something is the literal word of God. And the challenge, after you've decided something is the literal word of God, to respond to new ways of thinking and new situations. We are at a phase of history where numerous Jewish and Christian interpreters of the Bible, of their sacred words, are comfortable with the notion that there's inspiration here, but it's not the literal word of God, or not all parts of the literal word of God, or it's subject to historical analysis. And you even have, even back in the 18th century, you'll have people like Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, one of the founders of the United States, who's comfortable with, snipping and mixing and matching. And he's comfortable with saying, okay, the following 30 or 40 verses in the New Testament speak to me as the essential teaching of Jesus, and the rest is dross and problematic and doesn't speak to me. And he does this in the 18th century already. We're not in that space at all in terms of the development of Islamic history at this point. There are definitely lots of practicing Muslims who have, in their practice, in their practical lives, have chosen to consider some things more important than others, more valuable. Some texts in the Quran to have authority over their lives and some not to. But it's not openly stated in most places of the world at this point. It's at a very different stage of history. But that's not to say, I'll get this in a second, that's not to say that it's not going to change. And one of the most important things to remember about Islam is that with all of my talk about the rigidity of revelatory texts, there are 5 pillars of Islam, and you'll read about them. And you know, from prayer to charity, or to giving the zakat, to the Hajj, and to basically the basic notion of submitting to one God with Muhammad as his messenger. I mean, these are things that if you do them, there's an awful lot of people in the world who will say, well, you're a good Muslim, you've done the 5 pillars. Nothing in the 5 pillars says, literally, you have to believe that every word of the Quran is sacred. It's an assumption, but it's not in the 5 pillars. You know, the 5 pillars are basically, it's very easy to be a Muslim in terms of those 5 pillars. It's all the other overlay that make it into an orthodoxy that has to be subject to all of these controversies over interpretation. So we may yet see a lot of evolution and diversity of Islamic ways of living and ways of believing over time. It's sort of the same in Christianity, in the sense that, you know, Christianity without Jesus is not Christianity. But what is Jesus in Christianity, and what do you have to say? And what does it mean, you know, that Jesus is the Son of God, and what does that mean to you? All of these things, in principle, could be interpreted in different ways, and are. In the context of a free democratic society, people mean very different things by that. And that's the way it's evolved. So I expect that over time, and with a freedom of conscience evolving, that's what's going to happen in Islam as well. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I personally don't think it's polar, where there's people who think it's literal versus people who think it's non-literal and so forth. I mean, I think there are a lot of Muslim scholars who think that it is the literal word of God, but then there is this cultural overlay that informs that understanding. So I would say that I don't think that it's necessarily so far, and I think that if people believe it is the literal word of God, that these Muslim scholars, that doesn't limit them to moving forward in different issues.
No, I should have emphasized that if, you know, for example, if Abdulaziz Sajjadina and other scholars think it is the literal word of God, that's not the end of the story. On the contrary, they are orthodox in insisting on working within the tradition, but on the interpretive level. Right. In other words, let's say there are, you know, 34 times that Jesus is mentioned in the Quran, and that's true. And there are any number of times that the people of the book, Christians and Jews, are mentioned and expected to be treated honorably and equitably. So they'll build on that in terms of a multi-religious approach to the world. The fact that there are other texts that are critical of those same people, of Christians, or the fact that there are other places where polytheists or non-believers are expected to be, you know, chased and attacked and so on, they'll contextualize, and they'll do the classic thing that monotheistic interpreters have been doing for a very, very long time in all 3 traditions, and that is that when something is there that is overtly problematic to their values or to their reason or their sense of science, is they'll bracket it and say it was in this context, in this particular place and time, that text was meant. And it was not meant to be a permanent assumption about how you should behave. That was in defensive mode, or that was in a later period of war, but not the original period of peace. In the original period of peace, it was pluralistic. In the period of war, it was a defensive concept, and it has to be understood in that context. So, a basic, what do you say in mathematics? There's the, not the algorithm, there is the, oh gosh, I'm stretching my memory from 7th grade. What is it? What is it when you have a proposition and then you have a
theorem proof?
No, something that's an adjunct to that, or a derivative of that, of the theorem. It's the axiom, and then there's something else. Logical, whatever.
Hypothesis?
No, but the second, in a secondary level, you're an implication of the theory, or the theorem of the axiom. Derivative, that's a good word. So the derivative of this is the derivative of the living reality of interpretation, or the fancy word we use for it, of hermeneutics, is contextualism. Contextualism, which I mean by contextualism, is the freedom to say that this text is still the Word of God, but it is meant for this specific place and time. That is a classic move in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam that basically frees the mind to use of reason to become part of the story, to become part of the interpretation. See, a text is dead. A text is, it may be the Word of God, but it's also dead. It doesn't live without a human mind that interacts with it. And in this, again, the Gopinian literature is so important. Nothing lives without the eyes that look at it. And of course, this is a paradox for religious orthodoxy or monotheistic orthodoxy, because it says it's rigid, it says it's unchanging. But the fact is that it's unchanging with a very specific lens. What really is the subtext of a lot of authority-driven arguments from the Catholic Church against the Protestants and from the rabbis against others is not that the text is rigid and unchanging. It's that we're the only ones who say what it really means. The contest is who has the right to say what it really means. To say what it really means. See, the postmodern move is much more radical. If you look at Gadamer and Stenger, anybody who's a pluralist, they're saying there are many interpretations possible. But that runs into the issue of radical relativism, and you're back to where you started, with absolutely no authority. The real contest is who has the right to say what it means, what it signifies. What does jihad signify? What does obedience to God, to be a loyal servant to God in Islam, mean? Does it mean the 5 pillars? Does it mean listening to the clerics on every law in Sharia? Does it mean covering head to toe? Or does it mean being modest in a different sense? What does it mean? All of that is interpretation on who has the right to say that. And it's the same in the history of Christianity. And this gets very bloody. I mean, 1,000 years of people being persecuted over what the word Son of God means, or what does 3 in 1 mean? Lots of people die on these issues. And lots of people are dying on this issue in the world of Islam today in terms of what is modesty. It's clear that the text calls for modesty. What does it mean? How do you interpret that? The more free things become, the more that there are democratic countries that are Muslim, you'll see very strong feminist interpretations of what modesty really means. And there are all sorts of reversals that are going to go on. But the commitment to the fact that the text calls for modesty will be there. It'll be clear. It'll just be, well, what is real modesty? I give you an example. Again, I come back to what I know better, but in Judaism, as in Islam, there are notions of of covering up women. In the not in the Bible, but in the rabbinic literature, which becomes authoritative, there's one sentence that says that the hair of a woman is it's a hard word to translate from erva. Erva. The hair of a woman is a sexual, not abomination, but it's a sexual organ that needs to be covered up. It's a sexual organ. If it's out there, it's like exposing other parts of the body. And so, out of that comes the traditional or orthodox notion that women need to cover, married women, not unmarried women, but married women need to cover their hair. And this is a big controversy because at various times it's been interpreted in more recent times that no, it's just in synagogue, or no, it doesn't mean completely. It just means